Hello, my name is Bill Jeffries. I'm the Senior Associate Dean for Medical Education at the Larner College of Medicine at the University of Vermont. And today our topic is going to be classroom flipping using classroom assessment techniques. We have three objectives. First, define terms related to active learning in health sciences teaching, describe the elements of the flipped classroom, and outline selected classroom assessment techniques that can be adapted to facilitate student learning in large groups. First, we want to deal with our frameworks and definitions. This involves four important elements: the constructivist model, active learning, the flipped classroom, and classroom assessment techniques. In the constructivist model of learning, learning is a product of the construction of meaning by the learner. The teacher should then create experiences that favor learning construction by the learner. That is, having group learning modalities, concept mapping, and other examples of teaching methods that promote the creation of new experiences for the student that require application of prior knowledge. So in the active learning model, the lecturer really provides only the description of concepts, and those then need to be interpreted by the brains of the learner, compared to the existing knowledge base that the learner already possesses, and then synthesize these two things and create new meaning and a new logical story that is then stored in the brain for further use later. When remembering the constructivist model and how it applies to teaching, we must remember that students have to assess and debunk misconceptions in their existing knowledge base. And that means that the teacher has to create the conditions that would allow the learner to do that. So for example, if a student has a preconception about any organ of the body, for example, they've used the analogy that the heart is like a water pump. At some point, they're going to come to the realization that the heart is not exactly like a water pump, and they're going to have to unlearn some concepts that they have previously learned in order to accommodate new facts about the heart that make it more realistic and make more sense. Let's talk about what we mean by active learning. Active learning is learner engagement in activities that force learners to reflect upon prior knowledge and apply it. Learning in which students are required to regularly assess their own degree of understanding. And finally, attainment of knowledge and understanding by participating or contributing through mental and physical activities, such as gathering information, thinking, and problem solving. Active learning is most often applied in the flipped classroom model, which is becoming more prevalent in United States medical education. EDUCAUSE defines the flipped classroom as a pedagogical model in which the typical lecture and homework elements of a course are reversed. Thus, in the traditional model, students typically attend lecture and then go home and try to apply the knowledge that they've learned in class to additional homework problems. In the flipped classroom, the students attain knowledge ahead of time, and then when they get to the class, in the presence of the instructor, structured classroom activities are enacted, and students participate in group learning to foster the concepts that have been learned, but also add additional knowledge and understanding through application of those new facts. The curriculum for a flipped classroom has several elements that are important to keep in mind. The first is the preparative assignment. So this is the homework assignment we talked about. This can consist of a video cast of a topic that you've prepared, such as this one I'm doing right now, of the specifics of the facts that need to be understood before you start the class. Sometimes instructors are tempted to use their previous lectures that they've now converted into an active learning exercise as the homework assignment, if you have an old lecture videotape, for example. I strongly recommend that you do not do this because the student compliance is low under these circumstances, and you might be faced with outright hostility. The elements for the preparative assignment should really be specifically focused on that assignment. Other modalities such as reading and online modules can be used. I strongly encourage that you do not forget about the step of readiness assurance. The flipped classroom model does not work if the students have not performed a preparative assignment. And in fact, students who show up unprepared will disrupt the learning of the students that have been prepared. So it's typical to include a step called readiness assurance, and this comes from it's borrowed from the literature on team-based learning, and this is a term coined by Larry Michelson. And you can ensure that students are prepared by assigning an online quiz on the material ahead of time, or giving them a live quiz as soon as they arrive for the classroom lecture. I encourage that this is not a formative grade, but rather a summative grade that's part of their final course grade, which ensures that students will take this seriously and show up prepared. Finally, there's a myriad of in-class exercises, and we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the possibilities in a moment. If you really are interested right now, I suggest you try Googling Jeffrey's Flipped Classroom, and you'll find a handout that has some of these possibilities in it. Among the best practices for in-class work is that we like to pre-assign our groups. This way the students can look out for each other and hold each other accountable for material throughout the year. The optimal size of a group in our case is anywhere between 4 and 8. Usually 6 is best. The in-class work should always follow the 4 S's, and that is, again, borrowed from Larry Michelson. Each group should be working on a significant problem that is a high yield information for the students. All of the groups should work at the same problem at the same time. This ensures that the class will not fragment into a number of different activities and chaos ensues. The assignment that's given in class should involve the students making a specific choice about the answer to the problem that's being posed to them. And there should be a right answer. So there should be the ability to discern fact from opinion in the classroom. And finally, the answers to these cases or problems that are proposed in class should involve simultaneous reporting, and that is that when the question is called about a specific activity, all of the groups should answer the questions at the same time so that they don't influence each other's answers. The final thing is that once you start to ratchet up the expectations of students and push them to higher levels of application, you should ensure that your assessments, that is the summative exams that are given either at the end of the course or at the end of the section, match the rigor of the group work. If you are going to require something much beyond knowledge recall in the in-class assignments, but then the assessments are only about knowledge recall, the students will start to resent and maybe even skip the active learning sessions that you've introduced because of there's no need for it on the final assessment. Finally, let's talk about classroom assessment techniques. These, as originally defined by Angelo and Cross in 1993, were methods for faculty to improve teaching through real or near real-time assessment of student performance. And there were several benefits. The most important one is that the class and course was improved by allowing the instructor to specifically examine student learning in response to teaching. It had an additional benefit that was noticed, and that is that student learning itself was reinforced through application, collaboration, peer teaching, and feedback. So in the Angelo and Cross paradigm, the faculty member would assess individual elements of their teaching by introducing a short activity into the lecture. And this would be specifically designed to determine whether students had actually learned one of the concepts or facts or pieces of material that were in their original lecture material. And then that information could be fed back to the faculty member for improvement of the teaching. However, what's been noticed over time is that the participation in those activities has really improved the ability of students to apply and remember that knowledge. And so the application of these classroom assessment techniques as we move into active learning in the flipped classroom really start to tilt toward the student. And what we see is the ability of students to think at higher levels and to learn and retain the information is dramatically improved when they use these classroom assessment techniques. So the purpose of my discussion today is to encourage faculty in medical schools to look at classroom assessment techniques as a replacement for activities that would normally be done to encourage student learning, because these techniques have been shown to be particularly valuable in the learning of the student. Here is a partial list of the classroom assessment techniques by category. And there's many, many more that are listed in Angelo and Cross's book that came out in 1993. To test recall or to encourage recall, you can have a background knowledge probe, which is similar to the quiz I just described. You can have students do a 1-minute paper in which they summarize a concept in 1 minute and hand that in for credit. They can identify the muddiest point. What is the hardest thing that has been the hardest concept to get across? And students can collaborate in their groups and come up with a muddiest point, which then can either be researched by the group itself or elaborated on by the faculty member who's presiding. For critical thinking, students can create a pro and con grid, which involves say, an example would be if you were looking at a drug, you would look at the benefits versus the risks. That would be the pros and cons, and listing those, and you can imagine how there's many more applications in medicine. Synthesis and creative thinking, there's a number of ones here. A concept map is something that is very well described in the literature and is a very important and growing technique that is being used in medical school teaching. Problem solving, there's a number of different concepts here. One is called What's the Principle, and this is where a number of cases are described, and students are tasked to name the principle that is responsible for the phenomenon or event that's happening in the specific cases. Finally, for application and performance, these are tasking the students with doing things that they very often do by themselves or in their study groups, except that in this case you get to be the supervisor of those activities. So directed paraphrasing is simply restating an important concept in your own words. Application cards is the creation of cards that are related to individual concepts. I'm sure most faculty have seen students create, for example, drug cards that have the name, the mechanism of action, the side effects, the application, etc. And then finally, student-generated test questions. So if students understand the material quite well, then they should be able to create meaningful scenarios and test questions that are related to that. So those are just a few examples of the use of the classroom assessment techniques as adapted for use in a flipped classroom. The contents of this video will now be used for a readiness assurance exam prior to the start of our session.